Hi, I'm Josh, the dad of hobbies. Today's hobby, movies, specifically movie remakes. Now, I know everybody's got their opinions on the fact that Hollywood only does remakes or sequels or franchises these days. There's no original ideas left in Hollywood, which I don't think is true, by the way. But I do also think there are some movies out there that deserve a remake, either because of the technology that we now have or because maybe the first time they weren't done as well. And while these movies may irk some people or ruffle some feathers, I think if you give it a chance, you'll find that doing some remakes of these films here might be a good idea after all. So here's 6 films that I believe should be remade in this modern time. First up, Forbidden Planet, the classic sci-fi film for a reason. This is the one that set the standard for so many things to come. Star Trek, Star Wars, all these other ones. You get a robot, you get hidden planet, you get a evil scientist, you get so many tropes out of sci-fi. But this was made in 1956, and it shows. And while I don't think that every single film from the 50s or 60s needs to be remade, I think there's a lot that could be done with this. And unlike, for those of you that may remember the Lost in Space movie from the 90s that sort of redid the TV show, I think if we took a really serious tone with Forbidden Planet and you update it in sort of that Twilight Zone or even Black Mirror type of vibe, you could really get some good stuff out of a Forbidden Planet remake. So that's number 6 for me. Number 5, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which for you movie buffs know was a tragedy train wreck of a film. You have Marlon Brando just barely being cognizant. You have Val Kilmer halfway in, halfway out of his own personal life. So many ridiculous things happen in this film that you really could get a good, solid horror film out of this if done right. Jordan Peele, honestly, I think could really do a lot of fun with this. You could really get some of the suspense, some of the criticisms of technology and animal rights even. The story by H.G. Wells that the film is based off of is a classic, and I think that you could really do this movie right if you had the right person behind it. So, Island of Dr. Moreau, number 5. Number 4, I know I'm already gonna lose millennials here, The Pagemaster. Look, The Pagemaster was awesome. It was one of those sort of hidden gem films that either you remember and love or you've forgotten about until I just mentioned it. Macaulay Culkin, Christopher Walken, so many great voices, mix of animation and live action in a way that was completely different from, say, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But this movie is over 30 years old, and that inherently doesn't mean it needs a remake, but I think you could do a lot more with this. I think the CGI technology of today, you could get so much out of. I think if you took some of the genres that this movie didn't cover the first time around and really dove deep into it, you also could, again, do some commentary on education, public school system, library system, right? I think there's ways to weave some of the messaging in there. You arguably even could get a miniseries or a franchise out of this if done right. But The Pagemaster is a beautiful tale, and please, if you have not seen the original movie, please go watch it. But there's a lot of potential here that I think they just couldn't do in the 90s that they could do now. And look, if you want to bring Macaulay Culkin back as one of the characters, I'm sure he'd be all in on it. Number 3, Never Ending Story. Now, you're going to get two types of people responding to this. Either it was terrible 80s schlock and it doesn't need to be remade, or it was perfect 80s schlock and it doesn't need to be remade. For the few of you that have even read the book, which, false advertising does end, the first 2 films cover mostly the plot of the book. The third film, by the way, has nothing to do with the book and stars an incredibly young Jack Black as a high school bully, which is just hilarious on so many levels. But there is a lot of fantasy work that can be done here. There's a whole world building concept that you could get out of this. Very easily could be a miniseries in the style of, the Rings of Power or Game of Thrones even, or anything along those lines. This, frankly, I think screams for an Apple TV remake. I think the Apple TV crew could do a lot with this. But even if it was just a one-off film, just by the nature of what they had to work with in the 80s, you couldn't get as much out of it as I think the potential lent itself to. And yes, it is revered. Yes, it is a cult classic. And trust me, I love it. But I think this is a film that could be remade if you held on to what the original, both story and film, was intending to do without losing, so to speak, the concept of the original. I think making it today, you could really get some amazing effects out of. But you would still need to do it right. And I think this one, arguably more so than any other movie on this list, this one, there's a thin line there. So, number 3, Never Ending Story. Number 2, Fantastic Voyage. So either you've seen Fantastic Voyage and you love it, or you have no idea what it's about. Classic mid-60s sci-fi film. The idea is that you go inside the human body, right? And which either spawned or just happened to have timed out to the Walt Disney attraction from the World's Fair. But either way, this honestly I think is the safest one to remake of anything on this list, because the way that the movie was done originally, you get this nice suspense sci-fi film, but it's fairly straightforward, right? They're going into the human body, they got to fix the guy, they got to get out before a certain amount of time, right? You don't have a hugely deep story that you have to rework or modernize or fix around. And so you could do a lot with that, right? You could get a lot of the technology again of today, or you could get so much out of character work that could go into these folks. This is a fairly straightforward summer blockbuster type of film that you could remake with, I think, very little damage, because it wouldn't need to rely too much on the old film or impact the legacy that it has for some people, right? But this is one where, arguably more than any on the list, your modernization of this would be a fairly straightforward remake with very little fanfare, but could add so much more to it. So, number 2, Fantastic Voyage. Number 1 is where I'm going to lose a lot of people, The Wizard of Oz. Now, hang on. I want to be clear. The Wizard of Oz film, right, the 1939 film, is a classic for so many reasons, right? Obviously, first film of color, tells an amazing story, the effects were great. And we've gotten others since. Some of you may remember in the 80s, the Return to Oz Disney film, which was far more terrifying and horror-driven than it probably should have been. There was a more recent one, I believe, just called Oz. Had Zach Braff, it had Mila Kunis. It wasn't great. And of course, Wicked, right? And the 2 Wicked films that we've gotten in the last 2 years are incredibly phenomenal in terms of their production value and their quality, not to mention the legacy of what was originally a book, then a Broadway show, then a film, right? I mean, you're getting so much out of this. But a lot of people don't know that the Wizard of Oz books, right, the L. Frank Baum books, there's 26 of them that he wrote, and then so many more from his family, and sort of spinned out of public domain into more. I don't quite understand how we have not gotten a Peter Jackson-style, Lord of the Rings-esque or Narnia-esque trilogy or franchise of Wizard of Oz films. There's so much you could do with Wizard of Oz. And again, don't get me wrong, the original film from the 30s was great, but it did this much of what the Wizard of Oz has. And at the time, it was groundbreaking. And it has set, even almost 100 years later, it has set the tone for what cinematic masterpieces should be. But there's so much more that you can do with the Wizard of Oz that has ever been done. And I think Wicked does a little bit of that, but it's focused on the Gregory Maguire story. I think you could get something out of Wizard of Oz that's never been done. The closest I've ever seen was the Nick Willing sci-fi miniseries Tin Man. Some of you may know that, which was a sci-fi take on Wizard of Oz. It still wasn't in the original, but it did pull in some more from the original, sort of meant as a dark sci-fi sequel in a sense to the story. But a fresh start from the top take on what the Wizard of Oz could be, on exploring these characters. There's so many more characters than just Dorothy or the quad behind me. You could do a lot, and you could also arguably do a lot either by setting it when it was written, which was a lot of social commentary, which the movie doesn't touch at all. There's a reason that things are certain colors and do certain things. Or you could set it in modern day, 21st century, and still get so much world building out of it. In either instance, I think there's just so much potential here, and it surprises me of almost anything else on this list that this doesn't have a remake, because there's just money to be printed here, right? Wicked has proved that. So that's number one for me, The Wizard of Oz as a full-on fantasy adventure franchise film. 6 movies that Hollywood should remake. As always, feel free to like, subscribe, follow, and thanks so much for watching, and check in next time to see what hobby I'll get into next.